Hello, I'm Neil Knobloch, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you a series of inclusive learner-centered teaching modules. This first module is going to focus on an introduction to backward design and learner-centered teaching. The objective of this course is to provide a general idea of the methods that will be used to engage students in a learner-centered teaching way. Our goal in this module is to help you to develop or redesign a course to engage students into learning experiences that focus on increasing or expanding their understanding. Three major steps to go through this process include planning, designing, and implementing your instruction. A number of learning objectives that we are setting out to accomplish in this first module are listed on this slide. As you can see, we're going to define the difference between knowledge and understanding, and then walk you through the backward design process, and then provide an overview of what learner-centered teaching is and what it looks like. Let's begin by sharing a traditional way that many professors and teachers find themselves as they begin their journey in a classroom. The traditional way starts by designing a course, by picking a topic, and then you think about, well, how would I teach this course? You would then go find resources and instruction to help you implement and accomplish teaching the course. This could include books, movies, cases, games. And then you think about ways that you'll teach the course, maybe lectures or different discussions and seminars. And then finally, you typically would think about ways to assess student learning. This is typically done through exams, essays, quizzes, could be case presentations, and classroom participation. But what is the problem of pursuing learning, teaching students in this way? The primary problem is that it's too vague. And I would like to propose three questions as you think about what it is that might help you to think about how you teach students. So think about, what is the purpose of the course, and was it to cover these topics, and then was it to understand what the book said? And typically these sources of knowledge drive our instruction. It's led by the professor, disseminating as much information as possible, trying to cover as much information as possible, and then it leads to students not understanding and truly grasping what the key concepts were in the course. So do students really understand when we teach them? And I would like to differentiate between knowledge and understanding. On the left-hand side, you'll see that knowledge is really focused on definitions and facts, and as well as key concepts. Typically, it's done in a way of sharing the information, and there's limited applications. And on the right-hand side, understanding is really trying to help students to not only understand the knowledge, but to know how to apply it, especially in new settings. And this could be done by unpacking what are the reasons why something would work or not work. What are the underlying causes and consequences of that knowledge in helping students to really grasp and put the knowledge into use. Difference between knowledge and understanding. This could be also looked at through the metaphor of a kitchen, if you will, or cooking. On the left-hand side, you'll see following a recipe is similar to knowledge, and this would be really outlining the steps and ingredients. You cannot cook without a recipe, and you focus on following the structured procedures. But on the right-hand side, a chef would be able to create new recipes, understand different ingredients, play a different role, and so they would be able to predict what could happen if an ingredient is added or if an ingredient is left out. And so the difference between knowledge and understanding is a key concept. When we move to be learner-centered, we want to focus on understanding. So in summary, the problems of being more teacher-centered in the approach is that it's too much information and it lacks application of the knowledge, Students may become disengaged or lack the motivation to want to learn it. And there also could be lack of alignment between what the outcomes are and what the teacher is actually teaching in the course, or what the professor is trying to accomplish as they walk students through various activities, and how those align with the assessments. So what is the consequence of this? And you can see that as we think about designing learning, we want to do it in a way that truly leads us to desired outcomes. So we have a number of unrelated topics and activities that could be perceived by students, which leads to confusion in understanding, well, why am I learning this and what is the big idea? It also could lead to being hard to transfer the knowledge to other contexts. If we take the approach of trying to cover lots of information, this could encourage memorization. It also reflects that knowledge could be short-term. It's memorized for a test, for example, an exam, and students really do not learn the information long-term, and especially beyond a test, in a way that they could remember and use it in their future careers. So this leads us to the question, how should we design our course to really focus on understanding, focus on application, and have longer-term outcomes and impact on students? We do this by using the backward design approach. And you'll see that this is a stair-step approach. And we typically think about the first step as defining what the learning objectives are. These also could be referred to as learning outcomes. Typically, learning objectives are more specific. They add up and can point to students to actually a larger outcome. And so learning objectives or learning outcomes need to be defined first. The second step is then to say, what would it look like if students could accomplish that learning objective or that learning outcome? So we need to define evidences of learning, as well as how would we assess, how would we know that evidence would help us to answer the question if students learned and accomplished the outcome and objectives we were after. And then finally, once we have our objectives and our evidences defined and what the task, the outcome assessment task will look like, then we go to the third step and we plan learning experiences for the students. So let's begin by identifying, well, what's a learning objective? A learning objective is what students should know. What do students need to know in order to accomplish what you as the instructor are setting out to help them do? What should students understand, as well as in what should students be able to do? You can see that these three focus on knowledge, understanding, as well as application. And we will actually then define how to write learning objectives in Module 2. The next step, the second step, is to define evidences of student learning and the assessment task. This focuses on three questions: how to measure the understanding, what should the professor or the teacher do to look for desired learning results, and number three, how to evaluate the assessment results. So once you have the information that the students were able to perform, how does that help you to know if they accomplished the learning outcome? We'll focus more deeply on these questions in Module 3. Then the third step focuses on identifying and outlining what are the learning experiences and the instruction. What will the professor do with students in the classroom, as well as what will students be doing in the classroom or even outside the classroom? So these questions are driven by how to identify the desired learning results. Also, what activities will help students to get to the knowledge or to understand what you're trying to teach them. You'll think about ways to engage students, and you'll also think about what is your role as a professor. And you'll see that that role may shift to being more of a facilitator of instruction. We'll dive deeper into this, into these questions and these components in Module 4. So now I would like to transition to learner-centered approaches. And as we think about how to be a learner-centered professor or teacher, it really centers around what are the needs and what are the assets that the students bring into the learning experience. And so we start with who are they, what are their background and experiences, and what do they bring into the learning experience. Then we as the instructor would think about how do we get them actively involved in the learning process. So the first domain approach we'll look at is called active learning. And this is really being able to help facilitate a learning process with students in a way that they are starting to think more critically about the knowledge in the classroom. The second is focused on inquiry learning. Well, this shifts from focusing on really understanding knowledge to how do I answer questions and how do I maybe solve problems. And so it starts to lead students to think about applying the knowledge that they're learning in a way that would help them to then make decisions and solve problems. The third approach I'd like to share with you is contextual learning, or also known as contextualized learning. Contextual learning is really taking students into a place or a context. Typically, it's outside the classroom. It's just easier to do that way, where students perhaps are studying wildlife habitat in a reserve, or perhaps where you could go to a river and do monitoring water quality tests. And you could also go to perhaps a history site. All of these are places of learning or place-based learning, examples of contextualized learning. Service learning is also a wonderful way of getting students outside the classroom and building relationships and connections with people in the community by conducting some form of service that relates to their classroom experience. These are the three approaches to learner-centered teaching that we will walk through also in future modules. So I'd like to define what is learner-centered teaching. Learner-centered teaching focuses on student learning. It encourages students to participate. It encourages collaboration and students working together. It also challenges students to think critically, and doing so in a safe environment where they understand this is the role of being engaged in a learner-centered way. It focuses on creating a meaningful learning experience where the instructor pays attention to what is the sense of climate going on in the classroom, and how do you help students develop this sense of learning together. It also relies on multiple sources of learning. It goes beyond just the professor being the expert, and that there are other sources of information that can provide expertise or knowledge in a way that students see beyond just the instructor providing that information. And then finally, it uses examples grounded in real-world experiences, real-life experiences. And this could be brought in through media into the classroom. It also could be asking students to go beyond the classroom and finding out how does this knowledge exist in the real world. Some of the benefits of learner-centered teaching are a more engaged, students are more engaged in the learning process, and they're in control of their learning process. So really the sense of developing student responsibility for their learning is critically important. It also will tend to increase student learning in the subject matter. The instructor may bring that as part of their enthusiasm and their interest in the course, but by asking students to engage with each other and talk about the subject and share experiences and work on solving problems together can create interest in the subject as well. Students will be interacting with each other, important because of industry expecting students to know how to work effectively in diverse teams. And then finally, we hope students actually learn beyond just memorization for a knowledge test or an assessment, where students can relate and the knowledge is relevant. They can relate to the knowledge and each other in such a way that this will stick with them in long-term memory. So as we look at two approaches to teaching, we started by taking a glance, looking at the traditional approach to teaching. And as you can see depicted in the slides, that this could be pouring knowledge in a student's head or a sage on the stage. And then we also did a quick overview on what is learner-centered teaching. And this is depicted with students in a collaborative setting. Notice no one is standing. Everybody is at the same level of authority, if you will, and learning how to become masters of the knowledge or the concepts. And you'll also see students doing, in this case, trying to apply knowledge or doing some hands-on experiences in a real-life way. So these two paradigms, or these two approaches, really are based upon teaching paradigms known as behavioralism and constructivism. And I'd like to just give a quick overview of what the knowledge base says and the theories behind learner-centered teaching in comparison to the more traditional teacher-centered approach. So you have behavioralism and constructivism being compared here on a number of criteria. First, the curriculum. For behavioralism, it emphasizes basic skills. It really begins with specific parts of a whole, and there tends to be heavier structure. I'll just kind of run down this column and then we'll compare to constructivism. For the materials being used, traditionally, textbooks have been the source of information. You also have repetition and memorization, really representing what students do for learning. And the teacher or the professor is the authority. They tend to direct what students will do, and they share the information, disseminate the information to the students. The value is are reflected by really sticking to the fixed curriculum, and making sure that knowledge is covered and that the students are then receiving that knowledge. So it almost feels like a checklist. How much did I get through today as the instructor? And then the assessment is reflected typically with some form of a standardized test or an objective-based test that now students could be normed against each other, or they could be compared to other previous cohorts as well. In constructivism, it's a different approach, and these assumptions are represented by the curriculum emphasizing the bigger concepts, and it really begins with thinking about the bigger picture or the whole. And then you get more specific as you drill down into the curriculum. The curriculum also can be flexible based upon students' interests, based upon events that may be happening during the time a class is being taught. It also draws on a lot of different resources, and most of these are beyond the instructor of the course. Of course, the instructor is facilitating and making these connections perhaps to other resource people, experts in the community, practitioners, drawing upon media, could be video sources, etc. The learning is experienced by being interactive, and the students are encouraged to really construct their own knowledge. They get to reflect on what they're learning, so it's not just what are you learning, but how are you learning it, and so that metacognition comes into play there as well. The teachers are really facilitators as well as coaches of the learning process. So if a student would come to the professor and say, "What should I do?" the professor may turn it back into a question, "What do you think we should do?" The values are based upon students' interest and what they bring to into the learning experience, based upon prior knowledge, based upon their previous experiences. And finally, the assessment is usually in the form of a variety of different tools. Could be formative and summative tools used to understand how are they learning it real time, how did they learn it upon the completion of the course. You can use technology to gather some of this information. And so it really may have a bit more flexibility and more of an authentic flavor to how students will produce the evidence of learning. So the focus here is really looking at these two different paradigms by thinking about what would this look like as we interact with students. So we're going to review the following statements on the left, and we're going to connect them to the teaching paradigms on the right. So as you look at this, I'm just going to pause and let you take a look at a few of them and see if you can match them up based upon the previous slide. So as you can see, the first one is looking for a correct answer to a question. If you pick behavioralism, that is correct. Providing praise to a student for giving a correct answer, again, behavioralism. Encouraging students to work in group, you're correct, it's constructivism. Using different resources beyond just one knowledge base or knowledge source would be constructivism. Letting students choose maybe a different form of an assessment, constructivism as well. Wanting the students to be quiet while you're disseminating in the information would be behavioralism. And providing different materials regarding a subject and expanding that knowledge base beyond just you as a teacher would be constructivism. And then finally, helping students find resources to help solve the problem rather than giving them the answers would be constructivism. So good job. Great way to kind of reflect on the two different paradigms. So learner-centered teaching, as we have reviewed, has three approaches: active learning, inquiry learning, and contextual learning. And that the roles of the teacher or the professors in this type of an approach would be facilitators. They would encourage students to also reflect on how they are learning. The learning outcomes would be student-driven, and what this means is that you would ask the students to give input on what that learning will look like. You would challenge students to think critically and do so in a safe way, an environment that does not make them feel so uncomfortable that they cannot be successful. So you may scaffold the learning to help them think critically. You would use a number of different sources for teaching and learning, and you would, of course, use examples in the real world, real life experiences to help them see the application of knowledge. We're going to review these three areas and just give you a quick overview. Active learning encourages students in the learning process. It increases students studying their interest and building their self-confidence. You can see students will develop a more positive attitude toward learning, and it'll improve students' achievement and their personal development. Different examples on the right-hand side would be class discussions, debates, writing experiences, perhaps peer teaching or working together in teams. Cooperative learning is think, pair, share. Visual instruction could include videos, images, and demonstrations. You could use game-based learning and role-playing. In Module 4, we'll outline this, that there's really 5 ways to engage students through active learning: verbal, visual, socially, and using real-time feedback, as well as kinesthetic or more of a hands-on approach to learning. Inquiry learning encourages students to think critically because they're solving problems, and it'll increase their curiosity. I mean, many times when you are presented with a problem in a safe way, in a learning experience, it tends to create interest and build curiosity, and it helps students to then deepen their knowledge by getting to the understanding level of really knowing how to apply that information. These examples are driven by 4 different approaches. You can see problem solving and making decisions is what drives these, but problem-based learning, case study approaches, simulations, and also project-based learning are the 4 that we'll discuss in Module 5. For contextual learning, this is a way to integrate classroom instruction to the real world, real life application. Students apply their knowledge in the community-based settings or out in industry or even the environment. You can see that it connects them to community needs and as well as industry needs and what is going on beyond maybe a campus or a school setting. Students make learning meaningful to students by getting them to connect with real people in the real world that are using this knowledge. And of course, this also increases and encourages higher order thinking. Some examples that we listed here can be driven by place-based learning as well as community-based service learning. And so the first one there is having a science class learn about environmental pollution. They could perhaps collect trash in an urban area out in the community and try to understand why that's a problem and how there might be multiple solutions to solve that problem. Another one could be a math class that does some work in calculating the amount of food that's consumed in the household and local community and how that feeds back into the supply chain and what that looks like in different steps of the supply chain. In all, Module 6 will really dive deeper in better understanding each of these approaches to accomplishing contextualized learning. So traditional teaching and backward design is something we want to contrast here. So we tend to think about, as we review this, what is the topic, how can I deliver the content, and how do I assess the students? This is a traditional approach. We want to compare and contrast that to the backward design. And so for backward design, we really begin with what are the learning objectives. I'm starting on the right-hand side and going to the left. What are the evidences that we would know students could accomplish those objectives? And then what learning activities and experiences would they engage in to then help them develop the evidence for student learning? The benefits of backward design and learner-centered teaching, you can see that backward design does help identify some clear course objectives. As we go through this in Module 2, you'll see it helps students to see why are they learning this? How does it compare to the big idea? Class activities are coherent and there's alignment with the course objectives, and the assessment tools are also aligned with course objectives. So you'll see the alignment comes through more clearly there. Learner-centered teaching engages students. It promotes higher order thinking, encourages learning by doing authentic tasks, and it also allows flexibility of instruction by adjusting and accommodating students' needs and interest with the development of how that learning experience is really a co-facilitated experience with the students. So a roadmap to learner-centered teaching may look like a teacher using the backward design process and thinking about their teaching paradigm, and then selecting one of the, well, really not one of the three, but any of the three learner-centered teaching approaches so that students can learn and develop understanding. So in summary, the essence of backward design is that a course must be designed starting with the objectives, beginning with the end in mind. The design stages identify big ideas as well as the objectives more specifically, and identifying evidences of learning that would help to know if students accomplish those objectives, and also then defining what the assessment tasks would look like to produce the evidence. You would plan learning activities in alignment with both the assessments as well and evidences as well as the learning objectives. And that learner-centered teaching is an approach that improves student capabilities by encouraging them to engage in learning activities, thinking critically, and practicing real-world knowledge in a real-world context and becoming a responsible citizen. In summary, these were the learning objectives of this module that you should be able to answer. And I also wanted to share a few resources that you can continue to expand your learning experiences with Module 1.